One morning I went for a walk, just like I had 100 times before. But by sunset, I was accused of trespassing, threatened with legal action, and sitting across from a police officer trying to explain why my evening stroll had turned into a criminal investigation. The shocking part, it wasn't the cops who set me up. It was my own HOA. Asterisk. I never imagined something as simple as a walk around my neighborhood could lead to a criminal accusation. It all began on an unassuming Saturday morning. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and after a long week of work, I decided to clear my head by taking a stroll through the trail that runs behind our subdivision. I've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years. It's a quiet place, mostly families, retirees, and the occasional jogger you nod at, but never really talk to. Our homeowners association, like many, has always been a bit overbearing. Fines for leaving your trash can out too long, passive-aggressive newsletters about lawn height, and of course, the unofficial patrols by certain concerned residents. You know the type. That morning, I took the path behind the rows of houses, a common walking trail that runs parallel to the back fences. It's technically on shared HOA land, but it's open to all residents. There's no gate, no sign saying private property or no trespassing. Just a well-worn dirt path lined with pine trees and the occasional rabbit darting through a bush. I've walked it dozens of times. Never had a problem. About 20 minutes into the walk, I passed behind a particular house where the trail curves slightly. I heard a door slam. Then, suddenly, someone yelled, "Hey, you're not allowed back there." I turned to see a man I vaguely recognized, one of the HOA board members, I think, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, and always wearing that same navy fleece with the HOA logo on the chest. He was standing in his backyard, arms crossed like a security guard outside a nightclub. I raised a hand and said, "I live here. Just taking a walk." He didn't respond right away, just stared. Then, in a tone so smug I wanted to throw a pinnacone at him, he said, "You're on private property. This isn't open to everyone. I'm reporting this." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking or serious. "Isn't this the HOA trail? I've used it for years." His face didn't budge. "That part of the trail is close to foot traffic. Unless you're a board-approved maintenance worker or have written permission, you're trespassing." At first I thought he was bluffing. I wasn't anywhere near his actual yard, and again no signs. Nothing suggesting I was doing anything illegal. I shrugged it off and continued my walk, a bit irritated but not alarmed. 2 days later, I got a call from the local police department. Not a voicemail, a live call. The officer asked me to come in for a brief conversation regarding an incident reported by the HOA. Confused, I agreed. I figured at worst, I'd be asked to clarify what happened, and that'd be the end of it. When I arrived at the station, I was met by a young officer who looked like he wasn't totally convinced about what he was reading on the complaint form. He led me into a small interview room and placed a manila folder on the table. "We got a report from the HOA that you were trespassing on restricted property," he said, flipping the folder open. "Apparently there's a section of common land behind the homes that they claim is off limits to residents, unless authorized." I couldn't help but laugh a little. Authorized by whom? It's a trail we all use. There are no signs, no fences, nothing to indicate that part is restricted. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what's odd. Usually, for a criminal trespass case to hold, there needs to be proper notice, signage, fencing, verbal warning with clear instructions to leave. Did anyone ask you to leave the area?" Well, the guy yelled at me, told me I wasn't allowed there. But by then I was already walking away. The officer made a few notes, then closed the file. "We'll look into it, but I have to be honest, this doesn't look like something that's going to go far." I thanked him and went home, thinking that would be the end of it. I figured the HOA was just being petty, and once the police realized I was a resident using a community trail, the whole thing would get dropped. I was wrong. A week later, I received a formal letter in the mail-in official notice of trespassing from the HOA's attorney. Not only that, but they were threatening to pursue civil damages for willful violation of community land use regulations. According to them, I had ignored posted rules and entered environmentally protected grounds without approval. I was floored. What rules? What environmental protection? This was a patch of dirt behind someone's fence, not a wildlife sanctuary. So I did what anyone in my position would do. I started digging. I went to the HOA's website, combed through the community bylaws, and found absolutely nothing that supported their claim. The common areas were defined as for resident use, and while they could restrict usage for safety or maintenance, any such restriction had to be posted physically and electronically. No signs, no emails, no notices, nothing. Even better, I found a digital archive of community board meeting minutes. Buried deep in a PDF from 2 years ago was a proposal by the very same board member who yelled at me. He had suggested closing part of the trail behind his home because foot traffic near the fence line created noise disturbances. The proposal had been rejected. It never passed a vote. Yet here he was, acting like it had. Now I was angry. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power move. He didn't want people walking near his backyard, so he took it upon himself to fabricate rules and intimidate residents. I gathered all the evidence, screenshots, emails, copies of the bylaws, and returned to the police station. This time, I asked to speak directly to the investigating officer. When I laid everything out, the officer was visibly surprised. "This changes things," he said. "This might not just be a false report. This could be considered misuse of authority." That was the moment everything started to shift. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a walk. This was about someone abusing power and thinking they could get away with it. Once I realized the depth of what was going on, I couldn't let it go. At first, I just wanted the whole thing to disappear. I wanted to move on with my life, enjoy the neighborhood I paid to live in, and not be treated like some kind of criminal for walking on a dirt path. But the more I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about how someone in a small position of power thought they could manipulate the system. After my second meeting with the officer, he promised to escalate the matter and conduct a more formal inquiry. That gave me some hope. But I knew how these things worked. If I didn't push, this could get quietly shelved and forgotten. So I made it my mission to gather everything, every email, every neighborhood post, even screenshots from the HOA's community forum that showed people casually using the same trail without issue. One post from 3 months ago showed a neighbor thanking the HOA for keeping the trail so well maintained. Another had pictures of kids riding bikes along the very stretch I was accused of trespassing on. If I was breaking the law, so was half the neighborhood. Still, I needed more than circumstantial proof. I decided to speak with other residents, especially those who had been in the neighborhood longer than me. I knocked on a few doors and explained the situation, trying to keep it casual, just looking for clarity. Most people were surprised. A few had no idea there was any restriction at all, but one couple, the Parkers, gave me exactly what I needed. Mr. Parker had lived in the community for over 20 years. When I told him what happened, he didn't even blink. "Let me guess," he said. "It was Frank, wasn't it? Guy with the fleece?" I nodded, and his wife groaned audibly from the kitchen. "He's been trying to control that part of the trail for years," Mr. Parker continued. "Used to complain at every HOA meeting about people peeking into his backyard. At one point, he even installed a fake "no trespassing" sign on the trail, until the board made him take it down. That was gold. If he had tried to mark the area before and was told to remove the sign, then it was clear the board had never approved that section as private. Mr. Parker even offered to give a written statement to the police. I thanked him, and suddenly, I had momentum. The next day, I followed up with the police again, this time with a printed folder of all the screenshots, statements, and the Parker's written testimony. The officer I had been dealing with wasn't there, but I was introduced to a detective who had just been assigned to review the situation. He took my file and promised a follow-up. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't letting up. I started getting notices in the mail claiming I was in violation of community guidelines and was being fined $200 for unauthorized use of protected land. They even threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't comply. It felt like harassment, plain and simple, and it made me wonder how many other residents had been pushed into silence just to avoid the hassle. I contacted a real estate attorney and showed them everything. After reviewing the HOA's covenants and the so-called restrictions, he leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "They're bluffing," he said. "There's no legal basis for any of these fines, and if they keep this up, you may have a harassment case." That was the first time I felt a real sense of control. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was preparing to push back. About a week later, I got a call from the detective. This time, his tone was different. "We looked into the HOA board records and your documents. We also interviewed several residents, including Mr. and Mrs. Parker," he said. "Let's just say your story checks out, and Frank's doesn't." Apparently, when questioned by the police, Frank claimed the board had passed a resolution to restrict trail access behind his property due to safety concerns, but when asked for the documentation, he couldn't provide it. The meeting minutes I found earlier proved no such resolution had ever been approved. In fact, Frank had tried multiple times to pass restrictions but was voted down each time. What's more, the detective said that Frank may have falsified elements of the complaint. He had stated that I ignored a direct order to leave the area and continued walking toward his yard after being warned. But security camera footage from 2 houses nearby, voluntarily shared by other residents, showed that I was already several feet past his property by the time he started yelling. I never stopped, never turned around, and certainly didn't approach his yard. When the detective laid it all out, it became clear Frank had not only filed a false police report, but he had weaponized his position on the HOA board to harass a resident for his own personal agenda. And that's when things started turning in my favor. The detective told me they were referring the case to the local prosecutor for review, citing possible charges of filing a false report and civil harassment. At the very least, the HOA would be under scrutiny, and Frank's position on the board would likely be reconsidered. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week. I wasn't planning to attend at first. I've never been big on these community meetings, but this time felt different. I wanted people to know what had happened. I wanted the board to see that their petty games had consequences. So I showed up. The room was fuller than I expected. Word had clearly spread. I didn't even have to speak. The detective's inquiry had already reached the board, and residents were asking tough questions. Why were false accusations being tolerated? Why was someone allowed to unilaterally decide which parts of the neighborhood were off limits? Frank was there, sitting at the end of the board table, arms crossed and lips pursed. He didn't say much. Eventually, one of the board members announced that Frank would be temporarily stepping down while the situation was reviewed internally. It was a small victory, but a powerful one. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. All this, the accusations, the stress, the police visits, over a simple neighborhood trail. It made me realize how quickly a person's peace of mind can be taken away when someone with just a little bit of authority decides to overstep. But it wasn't over yet, because while Frank may have stepped down temporarily, the fight too clear. My name and exposed just how deep this went was still far from finished. By the time the next month rolled around, my case had gone from a neighborhood misunderstanding to something much bigger. What started as one HOA board member overstepping his authority was unraveling into a mess of deception, intimidation, and abuse of power that had affected more people than I originally thought. A few days after that HOA meeting, I got a message from a woman named Ellen. She lived on the opposite end of the same walking trail and had heard what happened through the neighborhood grapevine. She wanted to meet in person and share something, she said, that might make the whole thing explode. We met at a local coffee shop. Ellen was in her early 60s, polite, but clearly agitated. She told me that 2 years ago, she and her husband received a violation letter from the HOA, accusing them of creating an unapproved trail entrance through a small gate in their backyard fence. She said it was absurd. The gate had been there for over 10 years, predating most of the current board. But Frank, the same guy who had accused me of trespassing, had insisted they remove it or face daily fines. When they refused, he allegedly began reporting them for other violations: lawn overgrowth, unapproved flower beds, and even for having a wind chime that was too loud. It got so bad that they eventually installed security cameras, and sure enough, they caught him on tape standing just outside their property line, taking pictures and scribbling things into a notepad. He was obsessed with control. She said it wasn't about rules. It was about owning the space around him. Ellen agreed to share her footage and story with the detective. When she did, it added a new layer to the investigation. Now, it wasn't just about my incident. It was a pattern of harassment. The police started reviewing prior complaints made by Frank, and they uncovered at least 5 other cases where residents had been threatened, fined, or intimidated by him, all based on personal grievances rather than actual violations. At the same time, the HOA board, now under public pressure, launched its own internal review. Several members began distancing themselves from Frank. Some even apologized to residents for not stepping in sooner. One board member quietly confided in me that Frank had been domineering for years, but no one wanted to challenge him because of his reputation for dragging people into endless bureaucracy and threats of lawsuits. The entire neighborhood seemed to shift overnight. Where people used to keep to themselves, now they were talking, sharing, comparing stories. A kind of collective wake-up call had gone off, and it was too loud to ignore. One of the turning points came when the local news picked up the story. A small segment aired during the evening report, framing it as a residents' battle with HOA power abuse. They kept names anonymous, but the story spread like wildfire online. Residents from other communities chimed in with their own horror stories. Suddenly, it wasn't just my neighborhood watching, it was dozens of others, some even reaching out to ask for advice on how to deal with similar problems. And while all this was happening, I was still technically under investigation, not by the police anymore, but by the HOA's attorney. They hadn't formally dropped the trespassing accusation, even though it had no legal legs to stand on. Their silence spoke volumes. It was as if they were hoping the whole thing would go away quietly. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With my attorney's help, I drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It demanded the HOA drop all baseless accusations, revoke any record of fines, and issue a written apology. If they didn't, we would move forward with a harassment lawsuit. The deadline was set, 7 business days. They responded in 5. The HOA sent a formal letter stating they had reassessed the facts of the situation and were withdrawing all accusations made against you. They also acknowledged that certain board members may have acted beyond their authority and said they were reviewing procedures to prevent this from happening again. No apology, of course, just the bare minimum to cover themselves, but it was something. And then came the final twist. Frank was officially removed from the board. Not just temporarily, permanently. According to the updated minutes posted on the HOA's site, he had violated the board's ethics policy and failed to disclose conflicts of interest. Apparently, one of the reasons he was so determined to shut down foot traffic near his property was because he was quietly negotiating with a landscaping contractor to plant hedges along that section paid for with HOA funds, which would have essentially privatized the area behind his home. So not only had he tried to bully people into avoiding the trail, but he was also using HOA resources to do it. The audit exposed it all. In the weeks that followed, something amazing happened. The neighborhood got better. The walking trail was cleared, and new signage was added to make things official and welcoming. The board changed some of its rules, adding more transparency and a resident feedback system before any future restrictions could be made. Residents who had stayed silent for years began speaking up at meetings. People actually started attending those meetings, not because they were angry, but because they finally felt like they had a voice. As for me, I walk that trail almost every day now. It's funny. The thing that caused all this chaos, a simple dirt path through the neighborhood, became a symbol. A symbol of standing up, of saying enough, and of refusing to let small-minded people twist the rules to suit their own needs. Looking back, I sometimes think, what if I had just let it go? What if I'd taken the warning, paid the fine, and stayed silent? That would have been easier in the moment, but it would have also meant letting someone else define the rules of the space I call home, and maybe that's the real lesson here. You don't need to be loud. You don't need to be aggressive. But when you know the truth is on your side, when you know something isn't right, don't back down, because sometimes the simple act of walking forward is more powerful than any shout from behind a fence.